Welcome, friends. It is wonderful to be together on this beautiful, sunny, seasonally cool morning. Let's begin by taking 3 breaths just to finish arriving and to bring us all into the same space and the same moment. So remember, we inhale and then we try to have the exhale be a little longer than the inhale. You ready? And breathe in. And exhale. And breathe in. And exhale. And one more time, in. And exhale. Thank you. Katie?
Good morning. I am delighted to welcome you to this special place. My name is Katie Yonda. Leslie Rambeau and I are your worship associates. Also participating in our service this morning, our guest musician, Bill Leeman, and our pianist, Lydia Madrick. We are grateful to the tech team, Michael Morford, John Leeman, Jim Asparo, who enable us to reach all of you at home and away. To our staff, Aaron Leventman, Mary Kreutz, and Douglas Kramer, to our greeters, welcomers, parking lot monitors, coffee makers, and all the many, many, many who helped make this morning happen. Please join us in singing hymn 1053 in the Teal Book.
It is time to light our chalice here in this space where love is at the center. And for you on live stream or later on the recordings, it's time for you to also light the candle that you have. We kindle now a growing awareness of gratitude. And when we experience gratitude for the care and courage of others in our repeated, everyday encounters, notice that. Bill, it is now yours. And I believe we have a song that was written for today.
Well, I've been thinking about how to make my life good. But there's so many things that need to be understood. Begin each day with a positive thought. Try to be humble, it's a good way to start. We'll never be happy if all we want is more of the things that we never had before. Be thankful for the stuff you already have on hand. Gratitude will help you grow and understand. It's hard to get ahead on your own from day to day. So appreciate any help along the way, and be grateful for those who make a difference and are your friends. They'll give you peace and joy in the end. Gratitude is an attitude that brings out the good in our lives. It'll help when things get a little rough. Makes everything we have seem more than enough. So thanks for the gratitude, it makes us feel real tough. Yeah, thanks for the gratitude, it really paves the way. Yeah, thanks for the gratitude, it really saves the day. Gratitude is an attitude that brings out the good in our lives. It'll help us when things get a little rough. Makes everything we have seem more than enough. So thanks for the gratitude, it makes us feel real tough. Yeah, thanks for the gratitude, it really paves the way. Yeah, thanks for the gratitude, it really saves the day. Thank you.
If you would now listen and reflect on the words that come from the poet Kathy Ross. The poem is titled, "If the Moon Came Out Only Once a Month." If the moon came out only once a month, people would appreciate it more. They'd mark it in their date books, take a walk by moonlight, notice how their bedroom window framed its silver smile. And if the moon came out just once a year, it would be a holiday with tinsel streamers tied to lampposts, stores closing early so no one had to work on Lunar Eve, travelers rushing home to get by moon night, celebrations with champagne and cheese. Folks would stay awake till dawn to watch it turn transparent and slowly fade away. And if the moon came out randomly, the world would be on alert, never knowing when it might appear. Spotters scanning the empty skies, weathermen giving TV odds, a 10% chance of moon tonight. And when it suddenly began to rise, everyone would cry, "The moon is out!" Crowds would fill the streets, jostling and pointing. Night events would be canceled. Moon closure signs would be posted on all the doors. And if the moon rose but once a century, ascending luminous and lush on a long-awaited night, all humans on the planet would gather in huddled, whispering groups to stare in awe, dazzled by its brilliance, enchanted by its spell. Years later, they would tell their children and grandchildren, "Yes, I saw it once. Maybe you will live to see it too." But the moon is always with us, an old familiar face like the mantle clock, and no one pays much attention to it. Tonight, why not go outside and gaze up in wonder, as if you'd never seen it before, as if it were a miracle, as if you'd been waiting all your life.
The moon's been beautiful this last week. 3 mornings of glory as it dropped into the mountains. 3 nights of brilliance shining through the dark. I tried to take a photo of it the other morning as it fell into the pink sky just above the horizon, and the photograph came out looking, well, the moon came out looking like a spotlight, all bright white brilliance with rays every which way, and then I realized I had to clean my camera lens. And it occurred to me that human courage and compassion are a lot like the moon. Beautiful, ubiquitous, and therefore underappreciated. If courage and caring were rare expressions of the human spirit, we'd celebrate them as the poet calls us to celebrate the rare and beautiful moon. But because our world is filled with ordinary people doing the extraordinary, and because they are everywhere, we take them for granted. This is true every day of our lives, and it is intensely true in this moment that we are living in. In the midst of the hard news this past week, there was also news of care and courage. News of everyday people working through the shutdown, stepping up to mitigate the ripple effects of frozen SNAP funding, collecting food, feeding neighbors. News of hundreds upon hundreds of people canvassing and voting and tending the polls. News about people paying attention to ICE and ICE's behavior right here in Santa Fe and showing up in protest. News of people using administrative means to slow down harmful behaviors. All the while, trying to hold on, each of these individual people, to their sense of humor, to our shared humanity, and to an emerging sense of caring human solidarity. It's been heartening to see that and feel that in the midst of the distressing glitz that crosses the headlines. And it's amazing, these ordinary people, like you, like me, who are acting with such extraordinary compassion and courage, are mostly invisible. They don't make a fuss about what they're doing. They just do it. The teachers, the nurses, the CNAs, the air traffic controllers, the grocery store clerks, the stockers, the truck drivers, all the workers who are continuing to work without pay or even the assurance of pay. All of those who've been shut out of their work and at the same time forbidden to use their time to advocate for their own best interest. They are some of you, some of us. And I am so grateful that everyone who is engaged in this groundswell of caring and courage is staying present. And I'm worried a little bit that because people's efforts are as understated as they are, that there are maybe people who are feeling embarrassed about being in a difficult situation without enough money for groceries, or embarrassed about not being able to show up at a protest because their job on the far side of this depends on that, or unseen because nobody seems to recognize that it's not just the SNAP recipients who are suffering, but the grocery stores and the people who work there, the checkers and the clerks. And so maybe they feel invisible. Or maybe even worse, they feel like our nation is telling them they are less than human. They have been othered and they don't belong. And I find myself thinking about last week and about how when we reflect on how our world would be different if something that we rely upon or care about wasn't there, what if all those people who are feeling othered and excluded, who are carrying so much of the burden, what if they just opted out? The cooks, the servers, the janitors, the physicians, the scientists, the essential workers, the ordinary folks who are feeling stressed. Imagine their absence. Imagine what that might feel like to them as well as to us. Imagine, and let your heart break open.
Each Sunday, we place 4 stones in our chalice to help us remember the future we are working for. The mountain-shaped stone prompts us to imagine a world where this place we gather, called in Tewa, Ogapoge, meaning white shell place, is cared for joyfully by the descendants of its ancestral occupants, together with all those who have come to love it and dwell in it. The geode inspires us to imagine a world where peace is endemic and war is a thing from the distant past, understood as an acute and deplorable failure of the imagination. The ancient fossil, studded stone, helps us imagine a world thriving in the midst of climate change, a world where human participation contributes to a biosphere that is vibrant and diverse and deeply alive. The layered stone asks us to imagine that the vein of quartz that divides it actually holds it together. May it help us imagine a time when the differences between us are understood as boundaries that connect us. We honor these boundaries and our differences and use democratic processes to ensure that all of us thrive. These dreams of respect and peace, of a healthy planet and a robust democracy become realities as we and other good-hearted people around the world work together to unravel racism, mend generational patterns of violence, fight for democracy, and learn to live peacefully and regeneratively on our planet. May we find joy and meaning in these struggles.
So we set aside a time each Sunday morning for the sharing of sorrows and joys. We know that when we share our joys, they multiply. We know that when we share our sorrows, they're easier to bear. The sorrows deepen the joys help us get through the hard times. So we begin with a joy for the welling up of young and renewed voters who showed up in last week's elections in so many places. And a sorrow from Gail Applegate, who writes, "My son-in-law's father died on Wednesday." Our hearts go out. All right. We have a note from Dell. I think it's maybe a candle of hope. This past week, I began a long, arduous, and expensive restorative dental health journey. I asked for your kind and healing thoughts and pagan UU prayers to whoever or whatever it is you pray for. And I would let you know that if you're on Facebook, there is a GoFundMe page to assist with the cost of Dell's procedure. You can find it there, or you can actually just go to GoFundMe and put Dell's name in, and it will come up. Diane, I think, is here, and she is the host of the GoFundMe. She could talk to you about the process for getting you connected to that. And Dell is here, and we are glad enough that he is well enough to be with us today. All right. Prayers for a full recovery for Susan Pisano, who fell hiking and broke a leg. Ugh. A joy from Larry Metzger about the glorious autumn we are having. Andrea Kasut offers a candle of joy for reunion with her 100-year-old mother, who she met in 2013. And I think that one was also from last week, but it's okay. Extra joys are good. Mary Nykirk is continuing to heal. She says, thank you for the healing vibes. She's down in Albuquerque in a rehab center. Also in Albuquerque is Nancy Sudimit, who is recovering after a fall, a broken hip, and a fractured pelvis. There will be cards for Nancy out in the foyer. She is at the Odelia Healthcare Center in Albuquerque. We have several birthdays this week: Daniel Clevenger E. Martinez, Nancy Gaffner, and Richard Palasi. And one of my favorite parts, we have visitors. If you are visiting with us, would you please, if you are willing, raise your hand when I call your name. Everybody else, look around and see if there's somebody you want to say hi to after the service. So we have Bill Leeman, yay. Gary Clendon from Cerritos, Gary, welcome. Becky Smith from First UU in Houston, Texas, my old stomping ground. Janice Allen and Ned Doty from Santa Fe, welcome, good to see you. Connie Burke and Sally Sorensen and Tracy Austin and Dave. We're glad you're all here. All right, let's light one more candle for the sorrows and joys which we have heard, and for the joys and sorrows that we carry in our hearts as yet unspoken. And let's sing Spirit of Life. We only have the Teal book today, so just if you don't know the words, just follow along or listen. And if you do, please join me. Resting now on the echoes of the music, I invite you into a time of quiet and contemplation. I invite you to close your eyes, if that is comfortable for you, to take a breath and to consciously allow your body to relax. As you exhale, Let any tiredness or tension or dis-ease exit your body on your breath and dissolve in the Santa Fe sunshine. Breathe and let your thoughts drift. Breathe and feel your heart begin to soften and to open. Let it unfold and stretch until it can cradle all of the sorrows and the joys, all of the anxiety and frustration, all of the pain and beauty that are part of this moment. Breathe. And as you let your heart unfold, become aware of the other people in the room. And know that you are held in a network of affection and regard, and you do not have to carry the weight of the world's burdens by yourself. Breathe. And settle into this quiet space, knowing that you are loved. As we rest together in the quiet, I would offer you these words from Joy Harjo. Praise the rain, the seagull dive, the curl of plant, the raven talk. Praise the hurt, the house slack, the stand of trees, the dignity. Praise the dark, the moon cradle, the sky fall, the bear sleep. Praise the mist, the warrior name, the earth eclipse, the fired leap. Praise the backwards, upward sky, the baby cry, the spirit food. Praise canoe, the fish rush, the hole for frog, the upside down. Praise the day, the cloud cup, the mind flat. Forget it all. Praise crazy. Praise sad. Praise the path on which we're led. Praise the roads on earth and water. Praise the eater and the eaten. Praise beginnings, praise the end. Praise the song and praise the singer. Praise the rain. It brings more rain. Praise the rain. It brings more rain.
All my words fall short. I got nothing new. How could I express all my gratitude? I could sing these songs as I often do. Every song must end, and you never do. So I throw up my hands, praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a Hallelujah. Hallelujah. No, it's not much. I've nothing else fit for a king except for a heart singing hallelujah. Hallelujah. I got one response. I've got just one more move. With my arms stretched wide, I will worship you. I throw up my hands and praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a hallelujah, a hallelujah. I know it's not much, nothing else fit for a king except for a heart singing hallelujah, hallelujah. Come on my soul, don't you get shy on me, lift up your song, 'cause you got a line inside those lungs. Get up and praise the Lord. Oh, come on my soul, don't you get shy on me, lift up your song, 'cause you got a line inside those lungs. Get up and praise the Lord. So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again, 'cause all that I have is a hallelujah, hallelujah. I know it's not much, I've nothing else left for a king except for a heart singing hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah.
Butter by Tony Hoagland. I think it was Marie who first taught me the art of spreading flattery on people, then smearing it around like marmalade on slabs of whole wheat bread, or how to spray them lightly with a mist of unexpected praise from one of those special nozzles you attach to the end of your garden hose. Walking around with her that year, I watched how she would lubricate the world. Nuns and firemen, nannies and human resource managers, 9-year-old kids in city playgrounds, and widows selling flags in Central Park. Pretty soon I started doing it myself, telling this person and that how good they look today, how rare it is to see a job well done, how excellent their taste in clothes. I like the way even the most crusty and resistant at first would startle under the assault, then start to flourish under the effect. I like to watch the moisture trickle down to their roots and then roll back up again to all four corners of the leaf. Why did I ever think that approval was gratuitous? Why did it take me so long that the power of sweetness is as great as the power of the river and the sun? If I can't improve the world by scorching it with truth, if I can't conquer it by twisting its arm behind its back, then give me some adjectives like lipstick and gloss. Give me some language like mint and honey for the heart. I will lavish the world with the power of butter. I will force it to feel good about itself. First, I will make it blush, and then I will step back and watch it shine.
What would happen if everyone in this room were to spread their gratitude and appreciation and attention like butter on the bruised and broken hearts of our friends and neighbors who are so valiantly enduring the pain that this administration is dishing out? What if each of us were to mist with praise and appreciation and positive regard all the ones who are showing up and working and helping and protesting? We can start by noticing people. And as we talked about before, by making eye contact and offering our own names and learning theirs. Because in doing that, we affirm that each one is a fully human being, valuable and beloved, regardless of the circumstances. All these helpers that Mr. Rogers' mom taught him to look for when the world was falling apart. Do you remember that? She said, when things are bad, look for the helpers. Well, they're all around us. But a lot of them are tired. And almost all of them are worried and afraid and on the edge of burnout and sometimes of despair. And when you're in that place, you don't feel very resilient. You feel kind of dry and brittle. And you know, a lot of us feel that, whether we think of ourselves as part of the helper crew or part of the few who aren't suffering as much. That doesn't matter. When we feel brittle and overextended and worried, we tend to be a little impatient, a little critical with one another. What if rather than doing that, snapping at people, being aloof or turning away, what if instead we worked hard to find one small thing to appreciate and to praise in that other person? Their cheerfulness, maybe, or their gentleness, or the quality of their attention, their reliability, their smile, their skill, their sense of humor, their attention to detail, their creativity, or warmth, or calmness under pressure, or their quick responsiveness, or their bravery, or dedication. What if we were to wander around practicing seeing people and finding something to affirm? You know, offering them a little bit of mint and honey and gratitude. It would be a start. It would be a reassurance, a little bit of warmth and sunshine in a worrisome and anxious time. You know, affirming someone's competence and worthiness and full humanity does actually make a difference. Now, beyond seeing people as human rather than as others and saying thank you, I mean, that's a beginning, right? We need to affirm their full humanity by treating people as human beings and insisting that our government do the same. And in a perfect world, we would do that with living wages and affordable housing and free childcare and free college and healthy food and no need even for SNAP benefits, but certainly full SNAP benefits where the need is great. We would want basic human rights for all of us. And we can work for this. We can lobby and agitate and vote to try to make those things real. But you know, we can't make it happen by ourselves. We can't even make it happen as a congregation. And none of us can make it happen in this moment. But gratitude and appreciation and affirmation of someone's core humanity, those are at our fingertips every moment of every day. They can be offered at every scale. We can offer appreciation like fertilizer to help people bloom. We can offer it to our congresspeople and senators when they are doing their part, right? We can see them, we can thank them, we can tell them we know it's hard and we're glad you're doing what you're doing. We live in New Mexico, we can do that. And when you see that our state officials are working hard, that our governor has called them into an extra session, we can thank them. And when you catch our city officials doing something good, well, guess what? They too could use a good misting with some appreciation so that they will keep moving forward on that track. Like the rain, right? Appreciation is like the rain. And what about the staff and the volunteers at our national and local nonprofits, all of whom are working overtime? Can you let them know that you're aware of their efforts, that you've noticed their sacrifices, that you're grateful for the ways that they help us and the ways they help our neighbors? And then, you know, you can always roll down the window and thank the guy who's patching the pothole, or compliment the clerk at the window when you go to get tags to take your recycling to the transfer station. I'm grateful to all of you because a whole bunch of folks signed up last week to help provide Thanksgiving dinner for the residents at the micro-community up at Christ Lutheran. And I'm delighted. I think we probably have enough volunteers for 2 groups of folks to volunteer on a weekly basis at the food depot, helping sort and pack things. We should have that in hand by the end of this week. And your generosity to Interfaith Community Services was heartwarming. Over $1,000. You guys are awesome. Can I smear a little bit more appreciation on you? You wonderful people. Let me invite you to offer that kind of care and appreciation to each other. Over 15 years, I've noticed some things about this community. People here tend to minimize their own contributions. Oh, you don't need to thank me. Other people are doing so much more than I am. And as a result, we sometimes take them for granted. Let's not do that. Let's fill them up so that they bloom and their happiness and confidence and energy level overflow. Because when it overflows, it's going to splash on somebody, right? And it might be somebody who really needs that smile or that joyful, affectionate response. Now, I want to put a little more ownership in your hands here too. It occurred to me the other day that just because the committee folks who historically have taken care of our Thanksgiving dinner are away over the holiday this year. And we're not hosting our congregational holiday gathering until 7 December. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be 1 or 7 or 19 different UU Santa Fe gratitude gatherings happening in this holiday season. Call them Friendsgivings, or Thanksgivings, or going out for coffee. I don't care. But think about how you might take the opportunity to spread a little butter and spread a little gratitude on some of the folks you know here in this community who might need it. It doesn't have to be a meal. You could go for a walk. You could go to a movie. Just share that little sweetness and help us all face the dark times we're living in. Last September, we talked about noticing the human beings around us and making eye contact with the little guy and learning their name and thanking them for what they do. And I want to reassure you that seeing people as fully human really is the first step to not othering them. And asking after their lives is the second step. And sharing a little bit of our lives is a third. And then working to make their lives a little more joyful and sustainable is a fourth. So with that in mind, when Katie and Leslie and I were brainstorming about the service, we were trying to figure out, okay, how can we up the ante from the eye contact and the name and the thank you? We wonder how we could make it easier for all of us to spread a little love on the folks we have been mentioning. Now, turns out that our new worship associate, Katie, is a photographer and an artist and a person with a huge heart. And she created a postcard for us with a view of Santa Fe taken up at the Cross of the Martyrs and looking out over the city. And on the other side, there's a simple message. It says, thank you for your care and your courage. We invite each of you to take one card and to write the name of the person you want to appreciate on the card, to write a note about something specific you appreciate about them. You know, their sense of humor, their promptness, their courtesy, whatever it might be. And then to sign your name on the bottom and give it to them. Okay? That's all. Now, I'm going to ask you to please share the cards with someone outside of our UU faith community here. Because while I know that you want to say thank you to each other, we don't need the extra prop to help us do that. It's pretty easy here to look someone in the eye and say, I'm so glad you're here, and shake their hand or give them a hug or walk out and get some coffee. As you go about your week this week, we decided we want to invite you to notice the moon and all of the ordinary people who are just as beautiful and just as brave as that moon. We invite you to praise the rain and the life-affirming actions of the people around you, because that's what brings more rain and more life-affirming actions. And we invite you to spread love like butter on the overlooked and weary folks that you encounter, even the ones you don't agree with, especially the ones you don't agree with, to help them survive and to support them as their hearts open and as they bloom. Gratitude makes a difference.
Now I've been happy lately, thinking about the good things to come. And I believe it could be something good has begun. Oh, I've been smiling lately, dreaming about the world as one. And I believe it could be someday it's going to come. On the edge of darkness, there rides a peace train. A peace train, take this country, come take me home again. Peace train, sounding louder. Guide on the peace train, come on now. Come on now, peace train. Peace train, holy roller. Everyone jump on the peace train. Ooh, come on now, peace train. Get your backs together. Go bring your good friends too, 'cause it's getting nearer. Soon it will be with you. Now come and join the living. It's not so far from you, and it's getting nearer. Soon it will all be true. Now I've been crying lately, thinking about the world as it is. Why must we go on hating? Why can't we live in bliss? 'Cause out on the edge of darkness, there rides a peace train. Oh, peace train, take this country, come take me home again. Oh, peace train, take this country, come take me home again.
Listen to the words from the interspiritual hermit, lecturer, and Franciscan brother, David Stendhal Rost. You think this is just another day in your life. It's not just another day. It's the one day that is given to you, today. It's a gift. Begin by opening your eyes and be surprised that you have eyes that you can open. Look at the sky. We so rarely look at the sky. We so rarely note how different it is from moment to moment with clouds coming and going. Open your eyes. Look at the faces of the people you meet. Each one has an incredible story behind their face. Not only their own story, but the story of their ancestors. All that life from generations and from so many places all over the world, and it flows together and meets you here like a life-giving water if you only open your heart and drink. See these ones that you meet often and offer them gratitude for their care and their courage.
As we go from this shared sacred space into our weeks, let us take the care and courage that Leslie and Reverend Gail have spoken so beautifully about, that we give to others, and remember to give it to ourselves. Care and courage, courage and care.
Thank you. And now if you would take hands with those who are sitting near you and repeat after me. May love and skill be in these hands. May love and courage fill our hearts. May love and wisdom light our minds. May love flow through us and walk among us. As we live our lives and work to heal our world. Amen, shalom, namaste, blessed be. Assalamu alaikum, ashe, aho. Now, turn and greet your neighbors, and don't forget to spread a little.
Thank you for joining us today, friends. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. Please take a little time and explore our website and visit our online welcome table if you'd like to know more about us. Otherwise, we'll see you next Sunday morning. Stay in touch and be well.